Congratulations to the performers yesterday. I feel so untalented, when I see that spontaneous kind of performance. Okay, so what we're going to do today, I'm going to go back quickly to something we saw yesterday, because the focus today will be on your schedules of commitments in the Pacer Plus agreement. So I will start by talking about the schedules. I just want to before that, to start by going back to MFN. So there will also be a presentation on something else, related topic, domestic regulation, but I will do that later in the day. I think it flows better if we stick with the schedules. We do also some exercise to see if we understand well some of the key concepts. And then this afternoon, with Richard, we'll divide the group in two, and then we'll listen to the questions you may have about your own schedule. And also, we probably would ask you some questions, about your own schedule as a bit of an exercise after we have reviewed some of the key concepts. Okay. So before we get to the schedules of commitment, let me come back briefly to what we saw yesterday, which is the MFN obligation. Okay, so the MFN obligation is not linked to the schedule of commitments. Okay, but as we saw yesterday with Richard, the MFN obligation also has in Pacer Plus a list of exemptions. So I think all of the parties have a list of exemptions to MFN treatment, including from the services chapter. Okay? So I just want to review that a little bit so that you see what a list of MFN exemption looks like. Again, to recap, MFN is about non-discrimination, but non-discrimination between, different foreign suppliers. So non-discrimination, in the case of the GATS or in the case of Pacer Plus, you cannot give a less favorable treatment to a Pacer Plus party than you give to other countries. Okay? So, and everybody within Pacer Plus needs to have the same level of treatment. All the foreign suppliers within Pacer Plus need to have the same level of treatment, and they cannot be treated less favorably than any other supplier in the world, subject to some exemptions. Okay? Non-discrimination between different foreign suppliers. Now, there are some exception derogations that are permitted. So when we think about MFN in the GATS, then of course there is, as I mentioned yesterday, an exception or a derogation for regional trade agreements like Pacer Plus, so you're allowed to provide preferences, that's fine. In the GATS, there are also exemptions that are allowed. So as I said yesterday, each WTO member is allowed, if they want to, they don't have to, but they can list exemptions to MFN. So they can list measures that are inconsistent with the MFN obligation, so that give some preference to one member compared to other WTO members. They can list that in their list of MFN exemptions. Essentially, they can only list that one time. So in the Pacer Plus, you have the same type of obligation, and you also have, like in the GATS, the possibility you had the possibility to list exemptions. Okay? And I just want to show you what a list of MFN exemption looks like, so you'll see it better if you look, from your computer. So this is the second slides I used yesterday, and you have the same structure within Pacer Plus. So this is an example from WTO. It's the list of MFN exemptions of South Africa. So I think it's their real. It's not a fictional example. It's their a real exemption. So it is composed of 5 columns. The first column indicates the sector. okay, the service sector, in this case, road transport. The second column, which is very important, indicates the measure, so the government, law, regulation, policy that is inconsistent with Article 2, so with MFN. Okay? It describes what is the government measure that is inconsistent with MFN. Okay, so in this case, essentially they have some, regional bilateral road transport agreements that provide some kind of a preference to certain countries. So the suppliers of certain countries get better treatment than suppliers from other WTO members. So you can think about the same kind of example in PACER Plus. The third column indicates the countries to which the measure applies. So essentially, who are the beneficiaries of the preferential treatment? So Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, and so on. Intended duration of the MFN exemption. In this case, they say indefinite. And the conditions creating the need for the exemption, so they explained a little bit why this was something that was necessary. Okay, because in goods you don't have the possibility to list MFN exemptions, but in services in the WTO you can, and typically in regional trade agreements you also have the same type of possibility. Okay, so this is typically to list MFN inconsistent policies that target a particular sector, a particular type of measure where you will give a preference to suppliers of one country compared to other PACER Plus parties or to other WTO members. Okay? So this has nothing to do with specific commitments or opening your market or not. This is about giving different preferences to different foreign suppliers. Okay? So we'll also see that when we discuss your schedules of commitment this afternoon, we can also have a look, as part of the same discussion, we can also have a look at your MFN exemptions. Because I think all of the PACER Plus parties would have within PACER Plus some MFN exemptions for services, and so we can have a look, and you can have a look to see what that means and what is the purpose of that. Okay? So these MFN exemptions in PACER Plus or in the WTO, it's not a list that you can, add to. You do the list once, and in principle, that's it. It's not, you cannot continually ask for or seek and add new MFN exemptions. Okay, you do it when you finalize the agreement, finalize the negotiation, and that's it. Okay, you can reduce the list if you want, but you cannot add new exemptions to your list of MFN exemptions. Okay? That's not as good as the first song that was sang last night, but it's my best attempt. So any questions, comments on that before we move to schedules? Yeah, I think we can load the second presentation. Okay, so now we move to the schedules of commitments. Again, I say the GATS here, but it's the same general approach in PACER Plus. So in the negotiations, there was a lot of discussion. Probably what took most time was to decide, what approach would be taken in PACER Plus to the services chapter, what type of modalities would be used, how would commitments be undertaken, because there are different ways to take commitments on market access for services in trade agreements. So one approach is what we call the GATS type approach, or a positive list approach, And in many regional trade agreements now, they use a different type of approach, which is a negative list. Okay, so there was a lot of discussion as to whether parties wanted to use a GATS-type positive list approach or an approach that is used in some other agreements, a negative list type approach. So I'll explain quickly the difference between the two later on, but let's focus first on the one that was used in the end in PESE Plus for services, and which is a GATS type approach. So the schedule of commitment is very important because it is used to define, to govern the key, maybe the key obligations of the agreement: market access and national treatment. Okay? And these are the two obligations at the GATS or in PESE Plus that imply openness to competition. You know, all the other obligations that we discussed, you know, transparency or different obligations, MFN, it doesn't obligate you to open your market. You know, you can comply with MFN, treat all foreign suppliers the same way, and having your market closed, right? They're all treated the same way, they're all refused access. You know, so what is really important are these two obligations, market access and national treatment. And these obligations, they do not apply automatically across the board. Okay, they are entirely negotiable. Okay, it would be a lot less difficult to explain and to go through if it applied automatically to everything. So that way, it's, you know, the explanation can be very short. But you know, parties both in the GATS and also in PESE Plus, they want these obligations to be negotiated. They want to select, you know, how it applies to different sectors, how it applies to different modes of supply. And so because there is this flexibility, because it depends entirely on negotiations, on what each member or party decides to do in its own schedule, this is why it's a bit more complicated. It's because parties wanted to have a lot of flexibility. Okay. So we'll see what these, we'll spend a bit of time to be sure to understand what market access and national treatment means. Essentially, market access is, it has a very specific meaning. It doesn't mean anything that, may impede access to the market. It has a very specific meaning, both in GATS and in PESE Plus. It essentially means the absence of numerical or quota type restrictions. So we'll see that in more detail. And national treatment means, and we saw that also yesterday, and we spent a bit more time on it now, it means non-discrimination, but it's not like MFN. It's non-discrimination, in this case, between foreign and national. Okay, so you cannot give a less favorable treatment to the foreign supplier than you give to a like domestic supplier. So that's why it implies openness to international competition. Okay? So before we get too much into it, just a quick overview, and then we'll dissect it together. So this is what a GATS schedule or a PESE Plus schedule looks like. PESE Plus is a bit different because there's no mode 4 in the services schedule. It's in the, essentially it's in the movement of natural persons schedule, but the structure is essentially the same. The first column indicates the sector where specific commitments are undertaken. So essentially the sectors where market access and national treatment will apply. And then for each, and then you have two columns, one which is titled Limitations on Market Access, the other one which is Limitations on National Treatment, which you have to fill out. And then you see 1, 2, 3, 4. Then for each of the modes of supply, you have to indicate the level of treatment that you guarantee. okay, or you have to list the limitations. So what we'll do now is to go a bit column by column. We'll explain the obligations, and then we'll go column by column to explain how this works. And then there's a last column, which is additional commitments, which is something that you can use if you want, but it is not mandatory. And you will see that, I think, for your own PACER Plus schedules, in a few sectors, you may have used this additional commitments column. So I'll also go back and explain each of these aspects. So it's important to understand that, and it's the same thing in the GATS or PACER Plus, that the obligations of market access, national treatment, they apply to nothing except what is indicated in your schedule. Okay? This is why we call it a GATS type positive list approach. It only, market access, national treatment, only apply to the sectors that are expressly positively inscribed in your schedules of commitments. Okay? So each member in the WTO and in PACER Plus, of course, it's an obligation. They need to have their own schedule of specific commitments to indicate how they will apply market access and national treatment. And these schedules of specific commitments are part of the agreement. They are annexed to the agreement. Okay, they have the same legal character. They can be subject to disputes the same way as any other part of the agreement can be. Okay, so they are also available on all the relevant websites, the schedules, along with the text of the agreement. So they should be read all together. The text of the agreement, both in GATS and in PACER Plus, indicates that, and you will see that in the agreement, in the chapter, it often says, with respect to sectors where specific commitments are undertaken, and then it indicates that where sectors are committed, each schedule should indicate, terms, limitations, conditions on market access, and on national treatment. You can indicate the date of entry into force of the commitment. You can indicate additional commitments, time frame for implementation, if that is necessary or not. So you already have this approach, these general parameters that are laid out in the text of the chapter itself. So I've already shown you an example. Again, in this case, health services. We'll go through how to actually list a sector and read and understand the first column. In this case, health services, hospital services. So there's a commitment only on hospital services. And then the moment you inscribe a sector in the schedule, you're saying that you will apply market access and national treatment to that sector. Then you need to indicate for each mode of supply what is the level of treatment that you will commit to, that you will bind yourself to, that you will guarantee for each of the mode for market access and national treatment. So there is a bit of complexity because you need to indicate different things. For just one sector, you have to indicate 8 different entries. For each mode, market access and national treatment separately, you need to indicate what is the level of treatment you will bind. Okay? But that is the flexibility that members in the WTO or parties in PACER Plus wanted to have. They wanted to have the flexibility of undertaking different levels of access or national treatment for different sectors, and also within the same sectors for different modes of supply. They wanted to be more open for certain sectors, certain modes, more open for market access than for national treatment. So this flexibility kind of adds the level of information you need to put in, and it adds to the complexity, but in the end, the purpose was to be more flexible and allow to, to have more variations in terms of what you want to do. Okay, so we start with the first column. So how to understand the first column. So there's a number of key principles. It's often something that is overlooked. The first sector, it just describes the sector. It's seen as something very technical, but in the end, it is something that is fundamental, and that is very important because it defines the scope of what market access and national treatment apply to. So depending how you define the sector, if you define the services very broadly, then market access will apply to a broader range of services. Okay? So it's a very important part of the schedule. And if you don't describe the sector very precisely, and maybe we'll see that with some of the schedules, then it's hard for others to understand what it means, what market access applies to. It's hard to understand for people who have succeeded the original negotiators, for other parties, and for the suppliers. Okay, in the end, everybody should have the same understanding. So in the GATS or in regional trade agreements that use this approach, there is no mandatory system to classify the sectors. There's nothing that's mandatory. Okay, in the end, you can use what you think is most appropriate as long as it's as clear as possible. Okay, because it's a legal contract in the end, so it needs to be clear. But there are important tools that are used. The first of those tools, and you have that in your in the documents we made available, it's what we call the services classification sectoral list of classification, or what we call the W120 document, which is something that was developed for the GATS negotiations in the 1990s, and that is used as general guidance, and it was used and is still used in the GATS, in the WTO, and it's also used typically in agreements that use a GATS type approach to scheduling. Okay, and that document, you would see that it divides services sectors in 12 broad sector groups. And within each of these 12 sector groups, you have subsectors, subsectors. So in the end, you have about 160 different subsectors of services. Okay? And for each of these specific subsectors of services, you would have what we call a CPC number. So you will see that in your own schedule. Okay? A CPC is a UN document which is called the Central Product Classification. We use a version from the 1990s which is called the CPC Provisional. Again, it's the same thing that is used in WTO and that is used in these types of regional agreements. And so the way it works is that for each of the 160 subsectors, you will have a CPC category that is attached to it. So for example, you would see the first sector is business services. Then within that business services heading, you have different subgroups, professional services, computer services, and so on. Within professional services, the first subsector, the most detailed level, is legal services. And then next to legal services, you would have a CPC number, in this case, CPC 861. And then if you look at the more, this is a big document on the CPC, you look at that, you open it up, you search, and then for CPC 861, you have a description of what is a legal service. Okay? You have a description, and then sometimes you have subcategories. They will further detail it, different types of legal services, notary services, services with respect to international law, legal services with respect to commercial law. Anyway, sometimes it gets into a lot of detail, and sometimes, you may have a lot of additional CPC. So CPC 861 may include, bigger numbers, so more detail. And the way you do it in the schedule is that when you list your schedule, you want to take commitments on legal services instead of everybody just using their own random definition of what is a legal service. Then you would just incorporate by reference, you would indicate in your schedule the CPC number, CPC 861. You put that in your schedule. And by doing that, you're incorporating the definition of the CPC into your schedule, just by listing the number. Okay? So this is how it is used, but again, it's a tool. It's something to help bring a bit more clarity, more coherence also across different parties, different members, about how to classify the sectors, okay, without making the schedule overly burdensome and having, many different detailed definitions of the same sector. Okay? But it's not mandatory. It means that if for the particular type of commitment you want to take, if you think something else is better or you want to deviate from that definition, you can do that. And in some cases, looking at your own schedules, you have done that. So we have one example here where they deviated from the CPC. So we have the example of a commitment within the education services group. Then we have the subsector primary education services. So primary school, essentially, you can see what it means if you look at the CPC definition, 921. But in this case, they did not want to commit on the whole sector. They wanted to take commitments, but not on what is the compulsory education, mandatory primary school education. So then they just indicated it, CPC 921, but excluding this or limited to that. This is just a random example, but you can, not the most common one, but you can think of different examples like that. Okay. Another example, a commitment on legal services, but limited to home country law only. The law of the foreign supplier, not the law of the host country. Or limited to international law only. This is the only thing you allow foreign suppliers to provide, foreign law or international law. So there are different ways you have a lot of flexibility, so that's why you will see different approaches by different PACER+ parties, but essentially the basic tools are the same. What we call the W120, the sectoral classification list, the groupings of the different sectors, and the corresponding CPC numbers. So these are tools to assist you. So when you see something in your own schedule, you see the CPCs, then you have to go and look at this other document to see all the details. Okay? So in some cases, again, it's not mandatory. There are some cases where governments typically will have alternative systems of classification, and you would see that possibly in some of your schedules. These were developed in the course of negotiations in the WTO. They were not necessarily followed by everybody, but members, when they negotiated, they said, we think that the CPC or the classification is not really the best one for this particular sector. So they all more or less agreed that they would use this other classification which better corresponded to the realities of the sector. And so again, this is used also in regional trade agreements. So in maritime transport, There's a maritime model schedule that is sometimes referred to in the GATS Annex on Financial Services provides for a listing of different financial services sectors, so that is more typically used, and same thing for telecommunications. But we can come back to this when we look at your own schedules. So these are if you look at the sectoral classification list, these are the 12 sectors. So business services, that includes professional services, so engineering, architecture, legal services, accounting, and so on. It also includes computer services and all other types of business services or business services applied to businesses. Communication, telecom, postal, courier, audiovisual services. Construction of all types. Distribution, retail, wholesale, for example. Education, at all levels of education. Environmental services, sewage, some cleaning services, financial services, banking, insurance, other types of financial services, health and social services, so essentially hospitals, tourism, hotels, restaurants, tour operators, tour guides, recreational and cultural services, museums and things like that, entertainment services. So some of what we saw last night was entertainment services, so live performances, that falls into that. Transport of all kinds, maritime, road, some air transport services, logistics, falls into that. So you will see that all the schedules, all the PACER Plus schedules are structured along these different types of groups of sectors. Okay, any questions on the, yeah, please.
On the services sector classification, just thinking about how the evolution of the digital economy,
Yeah.
there might be new services, sectors or subsectors that have come up that wasn't considered when the GATS was drafted back in 1995, or ratified. So I'm just wondering, in terms of now with current negotiations and modifications of schedules or specific commitments, are we finding that perhaps the classification may be inadequate in those sectors, and how do you address those issues?
Yeah. Yes, very good question. And it's very relevant because, the classification, the sectoral classification list was developed when the GATS was done by, governments, WTO members for the Uruguay round negotiations, so 1990s. And the CPC which is a UN document done essentially for statistical purposes, was done in the 1990s also. And of course, it was a different world, then when these documents were created. But I think but we still use that, and WTO members still use the same classification list, the same CPC. And the key issue here, and this has been developed through also jurisprudence at the WTO, is that the GATS essentially is technology neutral. So what you schedule are the services, okay? And what you describe in the schedule of commitment is the service. And typically, there could be exceptions, but typically you don't define your commitment on the basis of the type of technology that is used to provide the service. What matters is the service. Okay, so for example, if you take commitments on legal services, it describes what the service is. Legal services, advising clients on, international law or tax law or commercial law or whatever it is. But it doesn't matter in the end how the service is provided, whether it's provided on a phone, a fixed line phone, in person, through Zoom, through an iPhone 4, iPhone 5, iPhone 6. It doesn't matter, I think, in the end. And the jurisprudence so far has accepted, supported this kind of approach, which is is a good thing, because if not, then we need to. If the commitments were limited to the way they were supplied, the technology that was used to supply them at the time they were negotiated, well, we'd have to negotiate renegotiate the commitments, update them almost every 3 months these days, But so it's a very good question, but generally speaking, the commitments are technology neutral. And so you describe the service, and then any kind of technological means of supplying the service is covered, unless you explicitly say otherwise. But that's an important point. And that way it ensures that also the commitments in PACER Plus or the WTO or any regional trade agreement, it ensures that it remains relevant. Because if not, then it would quickly have no relevance at all. And so there's not, when you think about it, I mean, people can have different views, but I'm not sure there's a lot of new services. Maybe there are, but the categories in the CPC are fairly broad. There's some residual categories that capture certain types of services that are not explicitly very defined in a very detailed way. So I think the coverage is quite good. So I'm not sure there's a lot of new services. There's a lot of services that over time are supplied through different types of technology, and more to different types of digital technology. But that would be covered already by the existing commitments. Okay? So when you take a commitment to permit legal services without market access limitation, without national treatment limitations, then you commit to allow legal services, whether it's supplied by satellite or fixed line telephony, mobile telephony, in person, I don't know, whichever way may be possible in the future. Okay? So I don't know, some are trying to imagine how it could evolve in the future. We don't know. But in the end, what matters is the service. Okay, so coming back to, because you'll hear a lot about this, listing of approaches. So in the GATS and in GATS type regional agreements like PACER Plus, there was a positive list approach that was used. And of course, that contrasts with many other regional trade agreements which have decided to use a different approach, which is a positive list approach. But in effect, the positive listing applies only to the first column. Positive listing means that market access, national treatment apply to nothing except to the sectors positively inscribed in each party's schedule of commitments. Okay, that's what it means. Positive listing with respect to the sectors. It only applies to the sectors listed in the schedule. So if you look at your schedule and then you don't see audiovisual services, what does it mean? What does it mean? You look at your schedule, audiovisual services, you cannot find it. It's not listed anywhere. What does it mean? It does not apply. So market access, national treatment do not apply to that. So you have no obligations. Okay? Market access obligation, national treatment obligation only apply to the sectors you list. So if television services is not listed, then the obligation, in your case at least, does not apply to television services. It means that you're not bound to do anything. You can, if you want, You don't have to, but if you want, you can impose any type of market access or national treatment limitation at any time, at whichever level of restrictiveness that you want. You're not bound to do anything. You don't have to. You don't have to guarantee any level of treatment to anybody. Okay, so we've seen the first column. Now let's move to some of the others, and then we'll do a little exercise to see we've understood these other two columns correctly. So market access and then national treatment. So of course, we see what the sectors are. You need to inscribe the sectors to which you want the obligations to apply. But now we need to understand well what the obligations mean. Okay? So market access. So what does it mean? In the GATS, it's Article 16. You have the same, essentially, I think, word for word almost, in PACER Plus, the same obligation. And essentially, this obligation is about, more than anything, quantitative restrictions, okay? Which can be expressed numerically, so through a number, or through an economic needs test, which I'll talk about a bit later. And so when you give full market access, so when you comply fully with the obligation of market access, it means that you're not imposing 6 types of limitations. So in the agreement, market access is defined as the absence of 6 types of limitations. Okay? So what market access is in PACER Plus or the GATS is defined as an exhaustive list of 6 types of restrictions. So when you say that you commit to full market access, that you're not imposing market access limitations, it doesn't mean what you want it to mean. It means that you agreed not to impose these 6 types of limitations. So to be a market access restriction or to be market access limitation, a government measure needs to fit in that list. Okay, it needs to be one of these 6 types of limitations, and these are listed in the market access article. Okay, so it's an exhaustive list. It's not just any type of measure that has an impact on access to the market. It has to be one of the 6. Okay, and the other important thing is that these types of restrictions, essentially quantitative restrictions, can be discriminatory. They can discriminate against the foreigner. They can apply only to foreign suppliers, or they can apply to everybody. It doesn't matter. Okay, so it's not only about discriminatory limitations. They can apply to equally to everybody. If it fits within one of these 6 categories, it still is a market access limitation. Okay, so that's important to understand. And I'll explain why later. So it has to be one of the 6, and these 6 types of limitations, the quantitative restrictions are typically maximum limitations. Okay, not minimum requirements, they're ceilings, maximum. So for example, the first one, the clearest example, a limitation, and again, this is listed in the text of the article itself, a limitation on the total number of service suppliers. So whether it applies to everybody or not, a limitation on the total number of service suppliers. So you have one example here. It looks a bit ridiculous, but it's a real example. So limitation on the total number of licenses for cosmetology schools, 48. Not more than 48 licenses for the supply of cosmetology school services. Okay. So a limitation on the total number of suppliers. Can you give me another example? Maybe something a bit more common. Any idea? In telecom, maybe. Monopolies. So if you have a monopoly on the supply of a service, I mean, it's less the case now, but it used to be the case very, very much so in telecommunication services or some types of telecommunication services. A monopoly, so not more than one supplier, that's a limitation on the total number of suppliers. So, or if the government fixes a maximum number of licenses for mobile telephony, for example, not more than 3 operators. We fix a ceiling, a maximum. We don't let the market decide. We decide that there cannot be more than 2 or 3, and then it's a limitation on the total number of services suppliers. Even if it applies to everybody, it doesn't matter. That's not relevant here. Total number of suppliers. Then the others are more or less a variation of that. Limitation on the total value of transactions. So for example, or assets. So assets of foreign banks limited to 25% of the total. Limitations on the total number of operations or quantity of output. So restrictions on the number of films that can be screened, for example, or foreign films that can be screened. A bit less relevant nowadays with technology, but that was a good example. Number 4, limitation on the total number of natural persons in a given sector that can be employed. Then the last 2, this one is not a restrictive, a quantitative restriction, limitation on the type of legal entity or joint venture requirement. And the last one, a limitation on foreign capital participation. So a limit on foreign equity in a given sector, not more than 49% of foreign ownership allowed in a given sector. That's a market access limitation. Okay? So to know if some of your laws, regulations, and measures contain market access limitation, what is the question you need to ask yourself? You need to ask yourself, is it one of the 6? Is it a limitation on total number of suppliers, total value of transaction, total number of operation, total number of natural persons, restriction on type of legal entity, or a foreign capital participation limit? Okay, it has to be one of the 6. If it's one of the 6, or at least one of the 6, you need to provide for it in your schedule. It's a market access limitation. Okay? And so the idea behind that, of course, was to ensure that there would be some competition, because in a number of services sectors, there is discrimination between foreign and national, but in some cases you limit the number of operators. So in some sectors, like telecommunication, the main barrier was not so much discrimination, it was that there was only one supplier allowed. So of course nobody can access the market because there's only one that's permitted. So there was no competition. So the idea was to allow for competition, to allow the market to decide how many operators would be allowed to enter the market. And so with a number of sectors where there were such quantitative restriction, it was felt important to have these 6 types of restrictions. Okay, so this is what market access means in the context of PESE+ or the GATS and other types of agreements. National treatment. So national treatment's a different approach. So there is no closed or exhaustive list of measures that are national treatment or not. Okay? It can be almost any type of measure. Okay? National treatment, the obligation is that you cannot give less favorable treatment to a foreign supplier or foreign service than you give to a like domestic supplier or service. Okay, so it can be almost any measure. Any government policy will be a limitation to national treatment, will be inconsistent with national treatment if it gives a less favorable treatment to the foreigner compared to the national. So this can be de jure, what we call de jure discrimination, or de facto discrimination. Okay, de jure meaning the text of the law itself will draw a distinction on the basis of the nationality of the service supplier or the service. So there will be clear discrimination, set out explicitly in the law. Or it can be de facto. So on the face of it, there is no discrimination on basis of nationality, but in effect, there is less favorable treatment. So it covers all these types of situations, and so the test is spelled out in the text of the agreement itself. Okay, so it would be a national treatment violation if there's a measure that modifies the conditions of competition between foreign and national to the benefit of the national, or to the detriment of the foreign supplier or foreign service. Okay, so there the test for market access was, is it one of the 6? For national treatment, you essentially need to ask yourself, is it something that modifies conditions of competition in any of the modes between foreign and national? Is it something that de jure or de facto gives less favorable treatment to the like foreign service or foreign supply? So some example, discrimination, de jure, so in the text of the law itself, it's spelled out, domestic suppliers of audiovisual services are given a preference in the allocation of frequencies within the territory compared to foreigners, so there is explicit discrimination on the basis of the origin of the service or of the service supplier. And de facto, so it's a bit more difficult. This always needs to be assessed on a case by case in light of the facts of every situation, but residency requirement can be a good example sometimes. So in this case, a 3-year period of prior residency is required in order to obtain a license to supply veterinary services. Okay? So 3-year prior residency in the country. Okay, so of course for a national, if you're a national, most likely you've already been in the country for 3 years and more. But if you're a foreigner, that's very unlikely. So de facto, this is something that would discriminate against the foreign supplier. But again, it's always a case-by-case evaluation to determine whether de facto it's something that modifies the condition of competition to the detriment of the foreign versus the national. That's the basic idea. So in terms of examples, you can think of almost any type of government policy that can discriminate. It could be almost anything. So discriminatory subsidies, in PaySurplus, we saw that subsidies are excluded from the scope, so you don't need to worry about that. But in principle, subsidies could be discriminatory. Government could say, oh, we only give subsidies and grants to companies that are locally owned. Many countries would do that, actually. And you can do it, but you need to provide for it in your schedule. But that would be a national treatment limitation. Some nationality or residency requirements. So if you say that only nationals can provide legal services or certain types of legal services in the country, that would be a national treatment limitation. Any type of discriminatory licensing requirements or licensing procedures, any kind of particular registration or other requirements that are asked only of foreign-owned investment, foreign-owned established companies would be another example. Land, real estate, very sensitive topic, I know. Land ownership, but so you would have that in Pacific Islands, but also I think in Australia, New Zealand, you may have some types of policies in relation to land ownership, where land ownership is not permitted to foreign suppliers. They cannot buy land if they want to provide a service, they want to establish a supermarket or something, they cannot buy land, but the same type of business that is owned by local can buy land or doesn't face the same type of requirements. It's something that modifies the conditions of competition, or that can modify conditions of competition between foreign and national. So it can be, in some cases, national treatment limitation, and then you can find any types of other examples. Now, there can be overlap between market access and national treatment. So I think you would have seen that already. So market access limitation, only 6 types of measures. They can be discriminatory or they can be non-discriminatory. And some types of market access limitations, by definition, they are discriminatory. So foreign capital participation limits, by definition, that only applies to foreigners, it's discriminatory. Joint venture requirements, by definition, that's discriminatory. So you have measures that can be inconsistent with both the market access obligation and national treatment obligation. Okay, that happens fairly frequently. And so there is a rule in the GATS and also in PESA Plus that says, I guess it was just for convenience, I'm not sure it really is, was really that convenient, but there's a rule that says, well, for situations like that, you only need to list that limitation once under the market access column. So you don't need to repeat it twice. Okay, so if you have a market access limitation that you clearly is discriminatory, you put it once in the market access column and it's understood as national treatment limitation is simply to, I think the intent was simply to avoid repetition. I mean, that raises other issues, but that's for another day. And then just a quick summary before we go back to the schedule itself. So we understand now, and we'll do a little exercise to be sure we understand what is market access, what is national treatment, what it isn't. But everything is negotiable. So it's not because you put the sector in the column, in the column of the schedule, you put education, for example. It doesn't mean that you have to give full market access or full national treatment. It is negotiable. Okay, so you have to indicate for each mode of supply the level of market access and the level of national treatment that you will guarantee. Okay, so again, there's a lot of flexibility. So it's not because you put the sector that you're bound to not impose any and maintain any type of market access or national treatment limitation. In the schedule, you have to indicate something for each mode of supply. There are 3 general options. So these terms were agreed by WTO members in the GATS, and then in regional agreements that use the same approach, we use the same terminology. Okay? So the first entry, the first option you have is to say none. None means no limitations. Okay? It doesn't mean no commitment. It means the opposite. It means no limitations. It means a full commitment. It means you say none, it means you commit, you guarantee that for this particular sector, for this mode of supply, you will apply no limitations, you will maintain no limitations to market access or to national treatment. So a full market access, full national treatment. Okay? The other extreme, the opposite option, is to say unbound. Okay, unbound means you have no commitment. Okay, so you may decide, okay, you inscribe a sector in the schedule, but for a particular mode of supply, you don't want commitments for that mode of supply. So you just say for that mode of supply, you would say unbound, no commitment. So you have no commitment, so you can do whatever you want. You can impose any type of market access or national treatment restriction. Okay, unbound, no commitment, none, full commitment. Okay, two opposites. Don't mistake it. None means no limitation. We had some cases, in the past where a country would come with a draft and say, oh, here's my schedule, none, almost everywhere, but they thought it meant no commitment. And then, they had to change it a bit after that. And then in between those two extreme options, you have a third option, which is to list the limitations. Okay, you can list limitations. So limitations are measures inconsistent with market access or national treatment. So if you list it, that it means that you keep the right, you reserve the right to use, to apply, to introduce these market access inconsistent measures or national treatment inconsistent measures. So if you list it in your schedule, so say you have in your law, your telecommunication law says that foreigners cannot have more than 49% of capital in telecom company. That's in your law. It's a measure that is inconsistent with market access. So if you want to maintain that measure, you cannot say none, because that would go against it, right? So if you want to maintain that measure, maintain the right to use it, you need to put it in your schedule. So then you would inscribe it in your schedule, telecommunication services, mode 3, market access, 49% limit on foreign ownership. That's a limitation. So it means that you're allowed to impose this limitation because you have inscribed it in your schedule. And it means that aside from that, there are no other limitations that you apply in that particular sector and mode. Okay? Can we put the quiz I showed you? Yeah. Okay, so just before the coffee break, we'll just start a little bit of an interactive. Before we go back to see again the schedule, let's do a little quiz to see that we understood well market access, national treatment. I think this is also on the platform. On the website, so it's called exercise scheduling quiz. So you can go down, maybe boost it a bit more. Yeah, go down. Yeah. Okay, so in this little exercise, there's a list of different types of government measures, in a very simplified kind of way, of course. And then you have to tell me whether it's a market access limitation, a national treatment limitation. So basically, if you would reflect that in the schedule as a market access limitation or as a national treatment limitation, or it's neither one nor the other. Okay, so the first one, no more than 5 licenses for foreign insurance companies. Is that a market access limitation? Is that a national treatment limitation? Or neither one nor the other? Now, the question you have to ask yourself, to know if it's market access, you have to think, is it one of the 6? Is it a limitation on total number of supplier? Is it total value of transaction, and so on? If you say market access, it has to be at least one of the 6. National treatment, the question you ask yourself, is this something that discriminates, that give a less favorable treatment to the foreigner? So that modifies the conditions of competition between foreign and national. So what do you think? Market access? This side says market access. This side is not certain. What type of market access limitation is it? The first one, right. It's a limitation on the total number of suppliers. Not more than 5 licenses for foreign insurance companies. So there cannot be more than 5 suppliers or foreign suppliers of insurance companies. So it's a limit on the total number of suppliers, in this case the total number of foreign suppliers. So it is discriminatory, it is market access, so it is inconsistent with actually both market access and national treatment, and then in the schedule we would put it under market access in that case. So you can put an X here if you can. Okay. Second one, construction companies must request a building permit before starting work. Now that's very important. I mean, you're the kind of the guardians of the agreement. So, you have to be able to tell other ministries also how to comply with your obligations. So you have to know what is market access, what is national treatment, what they're allowed to do, where the agreement has no bearing or where they need to comply with the agreement. Construction companies must request a building permit before starting work. Neither nor. Is it market access? Is it a limitation on total number of suppliers? No. Total value of transaction, total number of operations? No. Number of natural persons, restriction on type of legal entity? No. Foreign capital participation? No. So it's not market access. Is it something that discriminates between foreign and national? No. Everybody needs a building permit before starting work. That's fine. That's not market access nor national treatment, so neither nor. Okay, very good. Next one. I'll go to this side now and ask you. Minimum capital requirement is of $1 million for foreigners and $500,000 for nationals. So I think what that means is that to be able to start operating as a supplier of whatever service, they require you to show you have a certain minimum amount of money in your bank account. That minimum capital requirement is of $1 million for foreigners and of $500,000 for national suppliers. Is it market access, national treatment? Neither nor. National treatment? Yes, very good, because of course there you have a different capital requirement, and it is the foreigner that receives less favorable treatment. You're asking them more, it's a disadvantage, it's something that modifies conditions of competition to the detriment of the foreign supplier. Is it market access? I haven't forgotten you this side. Huh? So is it market access? Is it a limit on the total number of suppliers? No. You can have 100 different suppliers as long as they meet all the criteria. There's no limit, no ceiling on the total number of suppliers, no maximum value of transactions, no number of operations, no total number of natural persons, no foreign capital participation, no. This is a minimum capital requirement, so it's not the same thing. Joint venture requirement, type of legal entity, no. So it's not market access, it's only national treatment. Okay, so for number 3, we can say national treatment. Number 4, foreigners are not allowed to buy land. National treatment, very good. Everybody agrees that this is a limitation, yes. Foreign capital participation is limited to 49%. Market access, it is clearly one of the 6. It's the last one. Limit on foreign capital participation. It is also by definition inconsistent with national treatment. So in this case, we only need to list it in market access column. Okay, so 4 we can say national treatment, and 5 market access. Number 6, foreign companies must provide training to local workers. And again, it's not, whether it's good or bad, or it's just these 2 basic questions. Is it one of the 6? Is it a market access limitation? And to know whether it's a market access, it has to be one of the 6. It's not all the possible things that would affect, capacity to access. It has to be one of the 6. And the national treatment, is it something that modifies the conditions of competition to the detriment of the foreign supplier? Foreign companies must provide training to local workers. So I think what this means is that foreign companies must provide a certain level of training to local workers, but local companies don't have to provide training to local workers. I think that's what it means. I hear very, very faint voices. So indeed, I heard national treatment. National treatment, yes, national treatment, because you have a requirement that is imposed only on the foreign company. So you require the foreign company to provide training to local workers. You don't require the similar local company to provide the training. So, this is extra cost and extra burden for the foreign company. So that is national treatment. So if you ask all companies of similar size or in the same sector, for example, to provide training, certain levels of training to local workers, then that's fine. But if you ask only the foreign-owned companies to do this and not the similar local ones, then it's a national treatment issue. Okay? Is it market access? No. The fact you have to train people, it's not a limit on the total number of suppliers, total number of operations, and so on. So in this case, national treatment. Universal service obligation for voice telephone providers. When do you want me to stop? When do you want me to stop?
You still have time.
Yeah. I can stop at any time. For the break.
The next session
Okay, no, but I'll have a lot more cover. Yeah. So universal service obligation in telecommunication would be where you require, the telecom operators to, to offer a certain level of service in all areas, for example, of the islands, not only in where they will make most money, but they have to offer a certain level of service also in the rural areas. So that's imposed on, the part of the licensing conditions. You would all do that, Pretty much all countries have universal service obligations that is imposed on voice telephone suppliers. Is it market access obligation? So it's not a market access. It doesn't limit the number of suppliers, the number of operations, and so on. It's not market access. Is it a national treatment limitation? Why? If you say yes, you have to. What is the discrimination there? There has to be a discrimination that is based on nationality. Less favorable treatment for foreign service supplier than for domestic ones. In this case, from what we have here, it seems that this is imposed on everybody. This is imposed on local suppliers of telephone services, foreign suppliers, so it does not discriminate. It's imposed the same requirement for everybody. Okay? Neither nor. Okay, let's take a break. Let's go have some tea or coffee, and then we continue. And then I will assign different questions to different tables, so as to draw answers from you. Okay, but let's have some tea and coffee first. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, by the way, just before we leave, the disperse for tea, just very quickly, because I noticed that some of you might not be able to access some of the documents. When you go into the PACER Plus website, the homepage, you notice events at the top.